All right. Hi again to everyone. Welcome and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us virtually today. My name is Hala Alawi, and on behalf of Atmosphere Press, I am so pleased to welcome you to today's reading of literary fiction. We'll be hearing from Eric Larsen, reading from the novel The Book of Reading, released November 22nd. Jeff Kirchick, reading from the story collection How Boys Learn, released February 1st, and Cynthia Reeves, reading from the novel and stories Falling Through the New World, released February 5th. All three authors' books can be purchased both from online retailers and from select bookstores. And of course, you can order the books on Atmosphere Press and Goldwake Press's websites. I'm also going to put some links in the chat just so you all can directly view those titles on their publisher pages. At the end of today's event, we are going to have time for audience questions. So during any of the readings, if you have a question for our authors, go ahead and type it in the chat and I'll make sure it gets asked. And then during the actual reading itself, please be sure to stay muted just so we can keep extraneous sound at a minimum. Of course, you can directly use the chat for any praise and comments. And one last note is that we at Atmosphere Press appreciate your support today and always. If you have a manuscript of your own, we would love to read it, so submit your work today to books@atmospherepress.com. Again, thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Eric, Jeff, and Cynthia today. We're going to start off with our first reader, who is Eric Larsen. Born in Northfield, Minnesota, Eric graduated from Carleton College and in 1970 took his doctorate from the University of Iowa. For 35 years, he taught English at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, CUNY, retiring in 2006. His first novel, An American Memory, 1988, won the Chicago Tribune's inaugural Heartland Prize. That novel was followed by three others, joined now by the Book of Reading, to complete a saga of family and nation. For 54 years, Larsen was married to the editor Anne Larsen, and the couple raised two daughters, Flynn and Gavin, both active and highly productive in the arts. Larsen lives in New York City and has also authored the nonfiction works A Nation Gone Blind, The Skull of Yorick, and Homer Whole, a reading of the Iliad. Learn more at www.ericlarsen.info. In today's reading, we're going to be hearing from the Book of Reading. Though born far apart, she in 1909, he in 1941, Evelyn Stahl and Malcolm Reiner are destined to meet, fall in love, and then try to save the nation. When? Autumn 1933. Where? Iowa City, Iowa, where both are graduate students. Their plan? I'll save that for Eric himself.
Thank you. Thank you, Hala. It's very sweet of you to give me this nice introduction. I'm grateful. The plan fails, and the couple aren't able to persuade the father of Malcolm to do what he can to prevent the inauguration of the CIA. Because it's Malcolm's view that very likely if the CIA hadn't been inaugurated in 1947, the assassination of President Kennedy wouldn't have happened. So they're hoping to avoid that. The way in which he's going to try to do that with Eveline's help is by imploring his father, who is an influential Navy officer cum small farmer in Minnesota, to try to prevent him from going to Washington to testify on behalf of, or not testify on behalf of, but to promote and advocate the course of action that finally is taken. So this then takes place, what I'm going to read, on a farm in a place called West Tree, Minnesota, which is also known as Northfield, Minnesota, West Tree and Northfield. But in any case, Eveline and Malcolm have very little luck with approaching the father. And in fact, about the journey, that is to Washington, D.C., he was adamant. Nothing that I was able to say and nothing Eveline was able to say made even the least inroad into the rock-like solidity of his determination to go. The father, by the way, is referred to in the book many times as my father, the nation I was born into. So you must really bear in mind that the father is highly symbolic, and perhaps even allegoric, as a figure of the, the Republic of the United States of America. I implored my father. They're sitting at a kitchen table, around the table. You know, I implored my father, pressing my belly against the edge of the table, leaning toward him, my hands extended. You saw that. You saw what happened. You saw them do it. You saw it happen. You saw them make the kill. But now we're back here, 16 years before it happened. They're doing this in 1947, as I said, and of course the assassination occurred in 63. So it's 16 years in the future as this scene unfolds. And in fact, before the group that did it had even been created. That means you have a chance to do something so that it won't happen. You have a chance to make it not take place. You have a chance to help make that group not come into existence. Why won't you take that chance? Night sounds coming in through the windows and doors, background orchestra of sawing crickets and pulsing frogs, call of an owl, the lone bark of a dog far off, once frighteningly nearby so that all of us jumped, the high, piercing shriek of something being killed, then a handful of muffled wing beats before silence again. I don't have the faintest idea what you're talking about, my father said. I have no idea what you mean. Someone killed someone? On the day of the assassination, after Fritz Dreisbach and I had finished dinner, I talked to my parents. I called them from the phone outside the concierge's office. A collect call. There must be a record of it somewhere, even though by now it would be over 65 years old. Nevertheless, I called them and we talked. They were shocked, of course, like everyone. My father, drawing a few words from his literary side, said that the assassination had sent us into the heart of darkness. Someone killed someone, he said now, offhandedly, as if asking about something that held no interest for him. As the alcohol continued to take greater effect, my father's range of attention grew more narrow. His attention went back to World War II, to the Navy, to the Pacific Theater. Nothing Eveline or I said or did could restrain him or keep him from returning there. In my father's view and in his memory, those days in the Pacific were of an almost unblemished perfection. Life inside them was clean, robust, honorable, purposeful, firm, and hale. Those many days in the daily life within them were dignified in their orderliness, poise, organization, and detail, above all, in the calling they served. Their purpose was to ensure the conquest of good over evil, honor over infamy, civilization over depravity, glory over shame, courage over cowardice, light over darkness, right over wrong. In the gradually narrowing eye of my father's memory, there appeared the image of an officer, handsome, lean, and tall, standing on the flying bridge of a medium cruiser on the open sea. Everywhere, sunlight. The officer looks out over the immensity of the South Pacific. The wind is brisk. It flips up a corner of the officer's shirt collar and then lets it fall again. The cleanliness, scent, and warmth of the air, all of these are memorable and perfect. My father wants to return there. He wants to stay there forever. This is the father allegorically again. He, as the nation I was born into, was a sensualist, nostalgist, and sentimentalist. These traits, by merit of his being additionally a solipsist, achieved a grip over his personality even more powerful than it might otherwise have been. It seemed to my father self-evident that such feelings as he himself experienced must, without question, be experienced also universally by everyone. Late that night, the walls of the kitchen quietly and unnoticeably fell outward, as if on the signal of an invisible stagehand, the same one who caused the ceiling to lift up and away, as if on hinges of its own, and then to disappear altogether. It was the same thing that had happened at Audrey and Ed LaRouche's apartment some time back, except that here it felt altogether different. It brought with it no sense of charm, wonder, assurance, unity, or pleasure. This time there were no faintly illuminated lines, shapes, tendrils, or circles radiating outward to the horizon. But instead, we were surrounded by absolute darkness, an entire world of velvet blackness. I imagined how we would look if seen from a distance away, a lighted area like a scene in a play, appearing as if suspended in the midst of nothing, a linoleum floor, three people at a round table, two sitting close to one another, facing the third, an overhead light hanging from the ceiling, even though no ceiling is there. Above all, my father's spotlessly gleaming white naval uniform. When the walls fell away, a chill came in from the night air, drifting over us. I had a clear sense at the moment I imagined seeing us in that way from far off and surrounded by darkness that everything was lost, as it was. The way it turned out, Eveline and I were to have one more day together, and most of a second one. Then my father would return to the farm. He'd gone off elsewhere, and it would be the end. If I had known with absolute certainty that the end was going to come and that it was going to come then and that it was going to come in the way it did, I think I might have found a means somehow to kill myself. I would have explained to Eveline, I would have pleaded with her, begged and implored her to understand. After all, her return would take her back to 1934. And in spite of the world's immense storage lockers of grief, depravity, murder, and horror waiting to be spilt open so that their poisons could spew forth, few of those things and little of their effect would reach all the way to her, especially if she remained near her home and went on reading and studying and weaving protective tendrils around the earth. Starting out again in 1934, um, I think I'll skip a little bit there. So she would have a home that would, for at least a certain time, protect her from the worst of the ruinous, demeaning, lacerating, and privacy-destroying forces that had been unleashed by my father's decisions in the cabinet room, first on February 27th, 1947, then again on September 18th of the same year, a single day after Eveline was sent back to 1934 and a single day after I was sent forward to the mean, thin, vacuous, atmosphereless, criminal, depersonalized year of 1964, where I was forced to live alone by myself, racked, tortured, ruined, flung into weakness and sickness by the suffering I went through from the loss of Eveline, the wanting of her, the wanting and never having, she being by then only an absence that I nevertheless craved and craved and craved until I was mad with craving. Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg told Truman that he could have his militarized economy only if he first scared the hell out of the American people that the Russians were coming. Truman obliged. The perpetual war began. Representative government of, by, and for the people is now a faded memory. That's a quote from Gore Vidal. It was past midnight when my father stood up from the table for the last time, not in order to make another drink, but to bring the evening to a close. At first, he looked quite unsteady, unsure on his feet, swaying noticeably, as if his height would certainly overwhelm his ability to balance, making a fall inevitable. But what shocked me slightly was his face. Its flesh was flaccid, loose, and sagging, almost like the face of someone asleep, or worse, like a death mask. But my father did a strange thing at that point. He leaned forward from the waist, and with his elbows straight and his hands a good distance apart from one another, placed the extreme tips of his finger on the tabletop, all 10 of them, well spread out from one another, as if the intent were to provide the most efficient support with the least possible contact with the table. As he did this, he stopped swaying, and his face began to get back its familiar shape and appearance, complete with one eyebrow raised faintly and mouth once again asymmetrical, slightly higher on its left side, in the expression I thought of as his predatory smile, lips parted only on the raised side, the faintest glimpse of a canine tooth visible behind them. He pushed his chair back and started toward the curve of the table, toward Eveline and me, one hand remaining in contact with the tabletop, palm held high, fingers spread out as before. When he came quite close to Eveline and showed no sign of stopping, she pushed her own chair back noisily, stood up quickly, and took 2 steps backward, away from the table. But my father simply diverted his own course in order to continue toward her. She took 2 more steps back. When I saw what was happening, obviously every word that Eveline had spoken to him all night had been like a call to his heart, even though his mind had accepted not a syllable. I got up and stopped in front of my father so that I was between him and Eveline. and stopped. For the first time in my life, the thought passed through my mind that my father at heart might be a coward. When I stopped in front of him, we were hardly 3 inches apart. His face changed instantly into an exaggerated look of surprise and alarm, the sort of thing you might expect on the stage of a backwater theater at the climax of the sorriest melodrama. The mouth and the eyes widened in fear, but that you would never quite expect to see on a real person, in real life, in a real situation. The chiseled good looks, the calculated, faintly taunting hauteur were gone, and the face left behind was soft, flaccid, cowering, and, if it had been anyone other than my father, pitiful. Or perhaps it was pitiful even so. It's perfectly conceivable that until this moment he had never believed I was real, or had never had to believe it. Or perhaps only now had he realized not only that I was real, but that I actually was his son. Distantly conceivable, although unlikely. It's also possible that I was merely seeing the wreckage caused by 8 martinis. I reached a hand back to make sure Eveline was still right behind me, and that I was still in between her and my father. Then I said, stepping out of his path and gesturing for him to go by, "Okay, Pops, bedtime."
Thank you so much, Eric. I feel
Thank
like we felt a lot in that reading. You really have a natural voice for that. Thank
Oh,
you.
goodness sakes, thank you.
All right, at this point, reading next is Jeff Kirchick. Jeff is the author of How Boys Learn, which is his second publication. His first book, Authentic Selling: How to Use the Principles of Sales in Everyday Life, was a winner of the Independent Press Award. Jeff majored in English with certificates in creative writing and French at Princeton University, and this collection of short stories is adapted from his senior thesis of the same title, written under the tutelage of Edmund White. Jeff's career to date has been focused in technology sales, and he was previously a sales leader for a startup that he led to a successful exit in 2021. Though he continues to work in tech sales, he has ambitions to become an author and screenwriter. In How Boys Learn, Kirchick presents an intimate perspective of boyhood, delving into the nuanced journeys boys navigate. These stories offer insight into friendships, relationships, sexuality, and the quest to become better individuals. Let's now welcome Jeff himself.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be reading from the third story in my collection called Why I Don't Believe, towards the end of the story, and to give some context for what's gone on, to date in the story. We have a narrator. His name is Nate. He's 13 years old. He's gone to the Berkshires to his best friend's family's house, his best friend Jack, and his father, Mr. Garrison, as well as Jack's younger sister, Rachel, and older brother, Arthur. Not too much has happened at this point, but he's very curious. He really admires Mr. Garrison, and he's interested in exploring the basement. So I'm going to be reading from the story now. I stared uncomfortably at the stuffed moose head that hung directly above me. I wondered if it was real, and if it was, if maybe it could look down on me. Probably not, I decided. And then I wondered what happens to us when we die. Is there even a heaven? Are we judged? And then I wondered about the basement again. By now I had to pee, and it had already been an hour since Jack had fallen asleep. Mr. Garrison was right that we could entertain ourselves in the loft, and we had, but he was wrong when he asserted that we would never have to leave, and that is because the bathroom was downstairs. So I decided when I went downstairs to use the bathroom that maybe, if I could overcome my fear of the dark, I would explore the basement. I removed myself silently from my bed, making sure that Jack was still asleep, and crept down the stairs. I was cold, and while hugging myself tightly, I realized a feeling of frightful solitude creeping up within me. The house was dark and empty, and I immediately second-guessed my decision to tour it before departing the next day. After using the bathroom, I walked down the corridor that Jack had led me down before. I took a deep breath when I reached the door and closed my eyes. I twisted the knob slowly and abruptly let go. I turned around to go back to bed, but then I thought about Arthur and Jack making fun of my fear of heights and spiders, my ineptitude with girls, and my distaste for vaginas. I became angry. I took the doorknob firmly and thrust myself into the darkness. When I eased the door shut behind me, I realized that the lock on the inner side was broken but covered in tape, and I had masterfully closed it without making a noise. I paused to look for the light switch. I fumbled around for an indeterminable amount of time, praying that I would find something. I did not want to go into the darkness, but I had come this far, and then I realized that there was another light switch at the bottom of the staircase, the one Jack had turned on when we played hockey the day before. If I could just make it to the bottom, I would be all right. I descended further into the darkness. I gripped the railing on my right and took a step, afraid I might miss one and fall. When my first foot landed, I breathed a sigh of relief. I came down harder with my trail foot, and the wooden board creaked below me ever so silently, sending waves of discomfort throughout my stomach. I studied the still solemnity of the blankness around me, but nevertheless, I continued with more conviction, keeping my eyes closed in fear that something might happen to me on the way down the stairs, that something might jump out at me, or that I would be suddenly hit or thrown into panic by some sudden noise. With each step, I felt like my heart skipped a beat. I could feel my hair raised on end in the intense coldness. And then, when I was about halfway down the stairs, I froze entirely at the sound of muffled noises coming from the corner of the basement. They were soft, shrill cries, and they came infrequently. When I first heard a noise, I stopped in my tracks and felt an icy chill run through me. Something else was down here, and I could not see it in the darkness. I waited, one hand gripping the railing, the other pressed against the wall, and my feet on separate stairs, taking deep breaths with my eyes closed and my mouth shut as my heart fluttered in my chest. I put my other foot down on the stair I had just stepped on and waited, listening for several minutes. I sat in silence for seemingly endless periods of time before hearing the noise. I thought about leaving, but wondered if the creaking noises I had made would only get louder and how exposing my back to the basement would make me feel more vulnerable. I tried to convince myself that the noises were from a heater or some other device. It seemed plausible, and I began to calm down. I opened my eyes and started to brace myself to move forward. Then, when I heard a soft grunt, it became readily apparent to me that these were human noises. Other people were down here. My mind raced. I did not want to find out what was down there anymore. I lost my ability to think rationally. Instead, it felt like a wave was crashing into my mind, dizzying my sight into blurry blackness. I started sweating as I stood there, my cold, wet hands now both clenching the railing. As each noise came, I would tremble a little more. Finally, I determined I had to leave. The grunting became louder, and I lost my composure. I needed to leave now before the person or people down there got a hold of me. But in my bold rush to leave, my foot caught the bottom of the stair behind me, forcing me to come down hard on the stair I had been standing on. It made a loud creaking noise, and all of a sudden the room and my mind, which had been crowded by seemingly loud rushed thoughts, were filled with silence. "Who is that?" a voice called out from the abyss. The sound made me open my mouth in horror. It was unmistakably the voice of Mr. Garrison. For a second, I thought that I could just explain myself, apologize, and forget everything. It was not a stranger, and I had no business knowing what he was doing down here anyway. But what would he think of me? What if he got mad and did something? I remained silent, closing my eyes and hoping everything would go away. I hoped he would fall asleep. I stood there like that for what seemed like hours, listening to my heart dance rapidly in my stomach, then slow down to a calmer, rhythmic beat. I wanted to take a deep breath, but I had to stay as quiet as possible. So I kept sucking in small breaths, exhaling slowly but softly. I opened my eyes, hoping that they would adjust to the darkness, but all I could make out was the rough outlines of shapes in the basement. If Mr. Garrison had decided to come upstairs, he probably could have been within a few feet of me before I would have been able to see any sort of figure. This thought crossed my mind, that I was defenseless and exposed. I felt naked. I felt violated. The light bulb from the corner of the room turned on, and we saw each other shrouded by misty graying darkness, two somewhat familiar shapes. The light half illuminated but granulated Mr. Garrison sitting upright and shirtless in a bed next to a blob under the covers beside him. I should have understood, but I was confused about everything back then. He kept his left hand firmly there and looked deeply at me, a scowl on his face. I had never seen him look at me like this. I was only dimly lit, but enough so that Mr. Garrison knew it was me. I started shaking uncontrollably. I would have to confront him now. "Nate, is that you?" he said, twisting his head so he could get a better view. He was so obscure in the murky distance that he seemed like a creature and not a man. I searched for things to say. I considered a last-ditch attempt at escaping since he was not completely sure it was me. In the end, I replied timidly, yes, it's me, Nate. Mr. Garrison violently reached for the bulb above him and turned it off. My eyes did not adjust appropriately, and I felt myself beginning to tremble as my fear of the dark reasserted itself. I then heard the sound of the covers as presumably he rushed out of the bed. I wanted to run now, but my feet were glued to the floor. What are you doing down here, Nate? He said in a worried voice, which was clearly approaching me quickly. I don't know. I got lost looking for the bathroom. You know where the bathroom is, Nate, he answered accusingly. Then I heard the creak of the bottom stairs. He was coming up the stairs. Yeah, I just wanted to explore a little bit, I said, trying to cover up for myself, hoping he would not hurt me or yell at me. I heard a creaking sound from right below me. He was only a few steps away now. I tried telling myself that this was not happening, that I had not intruded on him, that I had not seen anything. You know, curiosity is not always good. It can be bad. Didn't you learn about Adam and Eve? Or did Jews not believe in that? He was standing right in front of me now. I could see the outline of his rough exterior, his disappointed face looking down at me. Yes, I did. We do. I'm sorry, Mr. Garrison. He took a deep breath and placed his hand on my shoulder. The contact made me jump. I didn't mean that, Nate. Let's just pretend I never said that, okay? I was a bit startled. Why don't you go on back to bed now and I'll talk to you about this in the morning, he said, his hand gripping my shoulder blade so hard that I wanted to cry. Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Garrison. Good night. With that, I scampered up the stairs, and for the second straight night, I did not sleep well. For the second straight morning, I was also rudely awakened. This time it was Mr. Garrison shaking me to consciousness and whispering my name. And when I saw him, my natural response was to open my mouth to scream until I realized he was not trying to hurt me. Nate, wake up. I forgot eggs yesterday. Why don't you come with me so I can get to know you a little better before we go home later today? The last thing I wanted to do was talk to Mr. Garrison after the previous evening's fiasco, but I felt like I owed him something. The night before, I had begun to piece together possible reasons for Mr. Garrison's odd behavior, but none of them appealed to me until later that morning when we all sat down for breakfast. I assented anyway because I had to, and got out of bed to get dressed. I could not help but shiver as I crawled into the front seat of Mr. Garrison's car, half asleep. Part of me was worried he was going to drive me somewhere and leave me there, but I didn't know why. He seemed different all of a sudden, unshaven, more rugged, independent. He was less a superhero now, more a villain. He was more mysterious than the basement, but he also seemed more human than ever before. We sat in silence for the whole ride to the grocery store. He stole glances at me as if he was hoping to say something, and I was too afraid to initiate any sort of discourse with him as well. Somehow, I was relatively calm about this endeavor, and I attributed that to my extreme fatigue. I looked out my window sorrowfully, hoping to spot a deer or something moving, but all I got was snow and trees. Our car was the only one in the parking lot when we pulled into the grocery store. Then Mr. Garrison uttered the first words of our voyage. Stay here, Nate. I'll be right back. He got out of the car. I noted his flannel shirt. It was less stylish than the other clothing he had worn thus far. While he was gone, I thought about the night before. I had thought about it before drifting off to sleep, but I could not solve the puzzle. What were the noises? Was he masturbating? It seemed plausible, but it sounded like there was another person with Mr. Garrison. Was he cheating? No, I would have seen someone. Or maybe they knew the secret entrances and exits of the mysterious basement. Maybe that someone knew the basement very well. And what was all that nonsense about Adam and Eve? I didn't have time to dwell on it all for very long because Mr. Garrison had rushed back to the car with a pack of 12 eggs. The ride back was filled with conversation. He didn't even hesitate when he started up the car. So, Nate, why were you going into our basement last night all by yourself? Well, that's quite simple, I thought to myself. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. I was curious about all the doors and where they go. I forgot to ask Jack about them, and I was running out of time to find out. So it's nothing to do with Jack saying anything to you then? Why would Jack say anything to me? I wondered then, and even today, I am not sure I have every detail figured out. Nope, but I wish I asked him about it during the day. And what did you see or hear when you came downstairs last night? I coughed and thought to myself, I would just tell him the truth. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't really see anything, just you when you turned on the light and some soft noises. Perhaps you were snoring. Sorry if I woke you up. I was running on and on before he interrupted. Noises? He raised his eyebrows, looking straight ahead at the road at me and back and forth. Yeah, you know, like I said, probably just snoring or something. He turned his head and looked at me closely. I see, and then silence. I thought I was off the hook, but I could tell he was struggling to say something to me. Either that or he knew that he wanted what he wanted to say, but not how to say it. He started biting his nails with his free hand as he kept the other on the wheel. Nate, you're a very smart boy. Can you tell me why bad things happen to good people? The question caught me off guard. By now I thought Mr. Garrison was quite bizarre. What kind of question was that? I had no idea. I thought maybe it was because God couldn't be everywhere, but I didn't know how religious Mr. Garrison was, and he had already infantilized me in my Jewishness the night before, and so I thought that any answer I could come up with might offend him. Is this the kind of question they'll ask me at my interview for Exeter? I asked. He looked at me incredulously. Don't joke around, Nate. This is a serious question. It is the kind of question that anyone can ask, but no one can answer. I straightened my back in my seat and wondered why he would ask me a question if no one could answer it. Oh, well, sorry, I'm not really sure. Do you know? He shook his head. No, Nate, I don't know, but I wish I did, he said rather calmly, biting his lip at the end. And that was the end of our dialogue, for that car ride, at least. When we got back, Mr. Garrison drifted off silently to wake his children while I sat alone by the kitchen and watched television. I greeted Jack and Arthur when they sauntered in, and I said hello to Rachel when she shuffled in later. I could not help but notice how fatigued everyone looked, especially Rachel, who had long lines underneath her eyes. We sat quietly at the table while Mr. Garrison cooked eggs. He didn't look at anyone while he was cooking, except for fleeting moments when I noticed him watching me over the sizzling pans. He seemed nervous. I clasped my hands in my lap and tried to stare into space for a while. I thought silently to myself about whether or not Mr. Garrison carried on deeply philosophical conversations with Jack and Arthur. Then, for no reason at all, I looked at Rachel sitting next to me at the head of the table. Our eyes locked instantaneously. Her glare had pierced me to the point of shock. She had been looking at me all this time. Instead of looking away like I usually would when I was embarrassed like this, I delved further into her expression for only an instant. There was a sadness in her eyes that persisted throughout this silent exchange, this quiet discourse where she did everything but utter the words, "Help me." It was then that I knew. I did not quite understand what it was that I knew or how I could be so uncertain about what I perceived to be knowledge, but I knew that it happened. I knew it, but I couldn't believe it all at once, and for that I would plague myself through silence. Mr. Garrison coughed. Perhaps he had noticed Rachel's unspoken inquiry and asked us how we all liked our eggs. I refused to look at her again for the rest of the meal. I tried to stay quiet despite Arthur's attempts to turn the once somber atmosphere into a raucous one. I smiled at all their jokes and answered all of their questions politely, and for a brief amount of time, Mr. Garrison had stopped studying me. We packed our bags immediately after breakfast. For a second, I thought Mr. Garrison might hold me back to talk to me again, but no, he had seemed to return to his usual self. I tried to comprehend all the recent events, and though I understood that somehow I had changed, I couldn't figure out how or at exactly what precise moment. Either that or I decided to try and forget that anything had changed at all. This weekend was awesome. Did you have fun? Jack asked as he grabbed his backpack. It was awesome, man. I hope we do it again, I lied. We packed ourselves into the car in the same way we had on the way to the Berkshires. Arthur sat up front and babbled with Mr. Garrison about his upcoming hockey practices. Jack and I talked nonsensically in the back seat, and Rachel on the other side of us would keep herself from the world, isolated with her headphones on, watching the trees whirl by endlessly. But there was no mistaking the one difference between this ride and the last one. Mr. Garrison periodically observed me through his rearview mirror, pinning me down, transfixing me with fear. Yes, too many years later, as I still try to forget from my memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I think a lot of people in the audience could agree that, honestly, I mean, the tension in that story was basically its own character. So thank you for bringing that to us today.
Thank you.
So our final reader for the afternoon is Cynthia Reeves. Cynthia is the author of 3 books of fiction, the novel and stories Falling Through the New World, published by Goldwake Press, the novella Badlands, awarded Miami University Press's Novella Prize, and the novel The Last Whaler from Regal House Publishing. Her fiction, essays, and poetry have appeared widely and won numerous honors, including Columbia Journal's 2010 Fiction Prize for Falling Through the New World. Reeves has earned residencies to the 2017 Arctic Circle Summer Solstice Expedition, Hawthornden Castle, Galeri Svalbard, and Vermont Studio Center. In August 2024, she will participate in the Arctic Circle Alumni Expedition scheduled to circumnavigate Svalbard. A graduate of Warren Wilson College's MFA program, she has taught in Bryn Mawr College's Creative Writing program and Rosemont College's MFA program. Find more at cynthiareeveswriter.com. Falling Through the New World follows 4 generations of an Italian-American family set against the often tumultuous events of the past century. These 14 linked narratives gain complexity through the interconnectedness of characters and events, exploring the impact of the political on the personal, how the past shapes the present, and how identity is subsumed into an immigrant's adopted culture and its mores. Cynthia, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Hala, and thank you all for joining us. One of the central threads that runs through all 14 of the stories in this collection are the voices of 4 generations of Italian women, Italian-American women. I'm going to read from the opening pages of one of those stories, set in 1953. The story is called The White Nightgown, and the 2 women here are Anna and Rose, mother and daughter, who represent the 2nd and 3rd generation of this Italian-American family. The White Nightgown. I grew up with the white nightgown. It hung on a dressmaker's dummy in the corner of my bedroom. My mother, Anna, had draped it there carefully, as if the dummy were human and not just a life-size doll. The nightgown was made of fine silk, smooth as glass, turned almost to liquid. I loved running my hands over it. The gown was sleeveless, with a plunging neckline and an empire waist, from which flowed yards and yards of pure white fabric. The hem was edged with an intricately patterned lace that Mom called eyelash chantilly. She'd made the gown for her trousseau, she once told me, during the time she waited for her husband to return from a World War I Austrian prison camp to their home in Italy. As I grew older, I wondered about the timing. Why did Mom make her wedding night costume after she was wed? I hesitated to ask. The question seemed too private, along with a host of other questions it might raise. As a little girl, I thought of the nightgown as a plaything. Sometimes I'd take it down and try it on. Of course, it puddled around me like a white lake. Once, my mother caught me playing dress-up, but instead of chastising me, she merely smiled and said, "Rosemarie, you look so grown up." Mom was a wartime bride. In 1915, my father, Vincenzo, enlisted with his 3 brothers immediately after Italy entered the war on the Allies' side. At the time, he believed in the Italian cause to reclaim parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for his homeland. Only after Pop returned in 1919 from his time as a POW did he realize that the Italians had made a deal with the devil, as he liked to say, and never regained all that they had been promised by the Allies. Before he deployed, my parents married in a hasty civil ceremony. My maternal grandmother, whom I called Nonna, even though I never met her, insisted. She had her eye on my father's family home at the top of the hill in Rocamora and gambled that by war's end she might move up to that coveted house from their home at the bottom of the hill. Of course, her fondest wish depended on people dying. Pop's mother and father and 2 of their sons obliged. Uncle Lelio lived but emigrated to America soon after the war ended. Pop hardly ever spoke of the war and his imprisonment. "Rosie," he'd say, "that was so long ago." Mom would tell me he was fortunate because the camp's commandant needed a tailor, and Pop was a master of that craft. Fortunate. Such an odd way to describe what befell him. Much later, I realized he had what they call survivor's guilt. In addition to 2 of his brothers, 10,000 Italians died at Caporetto alone. My parents endured a second separation after Pop left for America in 1922. What was to be a year or 2 of separation became much longer when Mussolini decreed that wives had to stay behind for 7 years before joining their husbands abroad. Il Duce wanted the money that would flow back to a war-decimated Italy from prosperous emigres. Or Homesick men would return to Italy once and for all. What does all this family history have to do with the white nightgown? It was only after I was engaged to Frank that I understood. Mom was dying, and she wanted to make sure I knew what was involved in marriage. Sex, that is. We'd never spoken about it, but of course by then, I was 22, I understood the basics, even though I was a virgin. Confined to bed by the infirmities of heart failure, Mom could hardly walk as she struggled to breathe. One day near the end of her life, the Saturday after Thanksgiving in 1953, I'd helped her bathe and change into fresh night clothes. As I balled her soiled garments into the hamper by her bed, she touched my arm. "Let me get these in the wash first," I said. "The laundry can wait," she said, gently squeezing my arm. "I want you to have something for your trousseau, there in the cedar chest." I opened the chest at the foot of her bed, which was filled with the lace and linen she'd made during her lifetime. I'd always loved a throw she crocheted in an intricate pattern of overlapping diamonds. The throw lay on top, and I lifted it into the air. "This?" I asked. "Of course you can have that, but farther down is a peignoir. It matches the nightgown hanging in your bedroom. Can you get them?" I returned with the nightgown, dug out the peignoir from the chest, and laid both across her lap. I've told you that Pop and I married in a civil ceremony just before he shipped out. What I didn't tell you is that your nonna forbade us from being together because the church hadn't yet consecrated our marriage. I understood what being together meant. Even on her deathbed, she struggled to put into words what she felt I needed to know. It was only after the war and our church wedding that Pop and I shared the same bed. So that's why she made the peignoir set after they were first married, I thought. The delay also helped explain why it took so long for them to have a baby. But even after their church wedding, it took 4 years. In my heart, I felt that by making such fine things such as this for the future, there would be a future for us. She ran her hand over the nightgown and sighed. Pop suffered terribly in those first months back from the war. Every night I put on this nightgown, and every night I held him, hoping. And finally my patience was rewarded. She paused to catch her breath, a reflex that had become an effort of late. I thought it was a simple thing to have a baby, but getting pregnant took 2 more years. And in the sort of bad luck that stalked our family, I had a miscarriage. Then I got pregnant with your brother Luca just before your father left for America. I kept it a secret because I didn't want to alter our plans. What was the harm in waiting? We'd be reunited soon enough, I thought. Then the 3 of us would start over in America. A few months after Pop left came Mussolini's unexpected declaration. She began to cough, continuous wheezing that erupted from deep inside her lungs. I poured a glass of water from her carafe on her bedside table, sat down beside her on the bed, and waited for the episode to pass. She took a sip and swallowed, then rested her head against my shoulder. "Those first few years in Italy weren't unhappy, Rosie dear. I'd hate to leave you with that impression. I had Papa and Antonio. You couldn't ask for a more loving father or brother. My mother got her wish to move up the hill to Vincenzo's house. Side by side, my father and I worked together under a canopy of bougainvillea in front of Vincenzo's home. We were quite a team. Then Luca was born. I thought my life was almost complete." She fingered the lace, tracing the delicate scallops along the hem. "I was making a bridal veil when the worst thing ever to happen to me happened. Nona and Luca were at the lake, enjoying a holiday picnic with friends and family." She stopped again, wheezing, struggling to catch her breath. Water lapped over the edge of the glass she was holding. I took it from her and placed it on the nightstand. "We can talk about this later," I said. She told me the story of Luca's death many times. My brother was a ghost, ever present, hovering over us. As sorry as I sometimes felt for myself trying to fill the hole his death left, I felt sorrier for my brother Vinny, who, as their only living son, had bigger shoes to fill. And to think Pop never saw his firstborn son. I've tried to imagine what it must have been like for him to receive such news. Luca dead from typhoid brought on by drinking water from the lake. After his death, and while my parents were still apart, Pop had inserted a cutout of himself into a photo of Mom and Luca. So carefully did he compose the doctored photo that for years I'd assumed the three of them had been together, ever so briefly, as a family. You had to look very closely to notice the deception. Recovered from her coughing fit, Mom raised the nightgown in the air. Here, try it on. No, I said, I couldn't. Please, she said. It seemed an odd request for a mother to see her daughter, as she'd been seen by her husband on her long ago wedding night. Until she became too ill to care for herself, I'd never even seen my mother stripped to her underwear, let alone naked, nor she me since I was a child. But what harm to indulge her? Out of modesty, I suppose, she closed her eyes while I took off my pants and shirt and pulled on the nightgown and peignoir. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror that graced her armoire. The nightgown fit perfectly, the only hint of scandal, the revealing neckline. The silk was exquisite, but quite opaque, not like the sheer peignoir sets I'd been browsing in the Montgomery Ward catalog and dreamed of wearing myself. You can open your eyes, I said, and she did. She put her hand to her mouth and breathed a ragged breath. Lovely, she said. What do you think? It is lovely, I said, because it was beautiful. She patted the bed for me to sit beside her again, put her arm around me and pulled me close. She smelled of lavender, the bath soap I just used to bathe her. The very day I arrived in America, the stock market crashed. Pop likes to say it was all my fault. America was brought to its knees by my beauty. We laughed. And Pop and you had to move in with Uncle Lelio and Aunt Teresa to pool your resources, etc., etc. Aunt Teresa, she said, shaking her head. There are things you don't know. She lay back and closed her eyes. I thought she'd fallen asleep, but no. Your father and Teresa had an affair, you know. Right under Lelio's nose. Imagine the two of them carrying on while I was in Italy. And just that suddenly other pieces of our family history fell into place. Teresa had died of cancer 4 years before, and Mom had refused to go to her funeral. Caused a minor scandal in the neighborhood. Pop made excuses for her. Vinny had some make-believe, unbreakable appointment. Thought the whole thing strange, Pop lying to cover for Mom. I knew there was bad blood between my mother and Teresa. You could feel the chill in the air when the two of them were together. But I'd always assumed it was some petty misunderstanding. There were plenty of those in our extended family. 25 years had passed. What was the point of holding grudges? I loved my father. I sympathized with a man in the prime of his life who had been deprived of female companionship for 7 years. I loved my mother too, and understood that there were some transgressions that could never be forgiven. Mom opened her eyes. You don't seem surprised. It explains the funeral, I said. Did Uncle Lelio know? If he did, he never said. I fingered the lace edging of the peignoir coat. Tell me again how this is made. And she did. Something about bobbins and pins, the lace-making art I could never quite follow. She ran her hand over the silk fabric, still impossibly white, and traced the pattern of the lace she'd made so many years ago. As she talked, I imagined her in this very nightgown, probably feeling as anxious then as I did now about my forthcoming wedding night. Within months after she'd arrived in America, she was pregnant with me at 38 and scared. She knew what it was like to lose a child. Imagine that courage or faith.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That feeling of reaching across generations, it's a strange and a muddled one, but you know it when you feel it, and you've definitely captured that feeling. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm. At this point, we do have time for our audience Q&A. So if you have a question for one or more of our authors, go ahead and type it in the chat and I'll make sure it gets asked. We do have a question already for all three of you. This person says, you are all established writers before the publications of these books. Is there anything you've learned as a writer that you wish you'd known when you first started out? Maybe let's go in reading order. So Eric, do you want to start us off with this one?
What did I wish I had known?
Yes, big question, I know.
Yeah. Well, my own history is very strange as a writer. I published a novel in 1988 and another in 1992. And they went fairly well, but then something happened, and I wasn't able to get any attention from publishers, agents, or sales reps or newsmen for the other writing that I continued to do. So what I wish I had known, I suppose, let's see, I'm not sure. I went so far as to create a little press for the publication of my books and those of, well, we published 22 books altogether before the end of that little experiment came. But I guess I wish I had known the future, I suppose. But that's not a likely thing.
An
Yeah.
ever elusive thing to guess at for sure.
Yes, I tell you. Yeah. But
Yeah. Jeff, what about you? Anything you wish you had known before you started out with your writing?
Sure. I'd say, when I graduated from college, I went into a career in tech sales. And I didn't really start writing a blog until maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I wish that maybe I'd just been more consistent in putting myself out there and, churning out content. I think that that's probably my biggest learning.
Yeah, I hear that one a lot. So there's definitely got to be something there, but just wanting to be more consistent about it for sure. And Cynthia, what about you? Something you wish you had known when you first started out?
I think I would tag on to what Eric said, although it's impossible to know the future. I think the publishing world has changed rapidly, radically. I started seriously writing in the early 2000s, and um, there, on the one hand, has been a proliferation of ways to get published. But on the other hand, it's almost overwhelming the amount of material that's out there and trying to get your voice heard in that cacophony. I was just at AWP, which is the giant writing conference. It's in Kansas City. And it just struck me as I walked up, and anyone who's been there, there's this enormous book fair with journals that you've heard of or not heard of, publishers, uh, MFA schools, et cetera, and you walk up and down the aisles, and it just is overwhelming how many ways you can get published, and yet it still feels like a big challenge to get yourself out there. I guess you
Yeah.
can't know that, as Eric said, they couldn't know the future, so it's a good thing
But
sometimes.
yeah, impossible to know, but definitely possible to want to know.
Yes.
But yes, we have another question for you, Cynthia. Actually, this person wants to know what was your favorite thing, or what is your favorite thing about writing slash working at residencies?
Oh gosh. I think the main thing working at residencies, I haven't done so many, but pick and choose them. And the two that just stick in my mind are the setting of Hawthornden Castle, which is in Scotland. You're sitting, you feel the ghosts around you in this castle, and the way they run the residency, you have a lot of free time, but you also have time to talk to other writers. And then the other is the Arctic Circle residency, because how many residencies are aboard a ship that circumnavigates the archipelago in the Arctic of Svalbard? So I would say that the residencies both give you time to work on your work, but also inspiration from a completely different setting than the office that you normally work from, or the whatever space you work from.
Yeah, I'm sure that's just it can be such an enchanting experience. So, I'm living vicariously through you, as it were.
Just have to apply.
We've got a question now for Jeff. Are there any stories in How Boys Learn that you consider a favorite? I know that's a bit like picking a favorite child, maybe, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's a story in there called The Bright Lights. It's a story about a wrestler, a high school wrestler who, his dad is really hard on him and he's gearing up for a big match. And he has to cut a lot of weight in order to make weight for this big match. And it goes back and forth between the narrator as a teenager and him as an adult talking to a therapist, um, much later in life. And I wrestled in high school and college, so I think that it's personal to me. And it was a story that my thesis advisor Edmund White really loved so much that he actually shared it with John Irving. And I had an opportunity to meet John Irving to trade some notes about the story, which was very cool. So I would say that's probably my favorite.
Yeah, definitely. Those kind of connections, I think it's kind of hard to shake those, so totally understand that. This is a question now for Eric. Your bio mentions you're a grad of U of Iowa, and your book features U of Iowa students as well. Did you intentionally choose to set the book there as sort of a love letter to your old campus?
Mhm. Well, in some ways, I suppose, yeah. It it was a place that had a pretty big impact on my life, and it's a pleasant one in retrospect. I was there for for a year first, and then for another year later, and then for a couple of more years later still. So it was a speckled attendance. But there are a lot of things in the book that do draw on those experiences that without any question. And one of them being something early in the book, this character has a kind of a sort of a strange epiphany in hearing. He hears things that come from different distances away, as if they were all from the same nearness, and that's beginning his awareness of time being also ambiguous. And that was really something that happened. I mean, I was brand new there. I just got there straight away, and it was the first night I'd been in the place and knew nobody. And I had a little time to kill before dinner, and in this dormitory, and stood out on the portico, and those things actually happened. I mean, they didn't really happen, but there was the atmosphere enough to make it seem as though that would be perfectly credible. So it was a kind of a charmed city for me. Yeah, there's no question. It's quite lovely. I
Yeah.
don't know what it's like now.
One can only hope it's at least half as charming as you remember.
Yeah.
All right, we have just a couple other questions. This first one's another one for you, Eric. This person wants to know, has the elasticity of time been a feature in your other work as well? How past, present, and future intertwine?
Oh, I think probably so. Yeah. My first book was called An American Memory, and it was a look back. It was a somewhat autobiographical book. All of my writing is somewhat autobiographical, and I'm fascinated by and unable to escape the allure of time and the tyranny of time. And it's simply the fact that you go on living and you live longer and longer, and then what happened to the part that you already have lived, and you want it back. And so I think that's probably fairly natural for me to think into terms of that kind of time travel. People, Kirkus Reviews called called the book science fiction because of the time tripping, and I was so shocked. To me, it's not science fiction at all. It's just metaphor. The different times are metaphors for desire, or metaphors for memory, or metaphors for all kinds of different things. I think if it's science fiction, then maybe A Midsummer Night's Dream has to be science fiction too. But metaphor, I think time is a huge metaphor for us all, and a
Yeah, and it's
mysterious one.
definitely such a preoccupation of so many people. You know,
Yeah,
it belongs more than to the bounds of science fiction.
I think, yeah, yeah.
So we have one more question for all of the authors today. This person says, what pleasant surprises did you encounter in working with atmosphere? And I promise I did not pressure anyone into asking this question, but maybe we can go in reverse reading order this time. So Cynthia, do you want to start us off with this one?
Yeah, I should point out that my book got published through Goldwake Press, and Goldwake is this tiny press that is linked to Atmosphere through its executive editor Kyle McCord. And because Goldwake is he runs a contest every 6 months. And so twice a year, he picks 2 or 3 books to publish through Goldwake. But he uses Atmosphere's staff, including his one of his wonderful designers, Kevin Stone, did the cover. Kevin, the only problem I have with Kevin is that he gave me 15 covers to choose from. And now I see why they do not let authors generally have a lot of input into what the cover design is, because it was really difficult to choose. That's what I'll just leave it at that. But also I was able to use some of the other staff, including Hala, to help with the marketing of the book, which is really important. And it's been a wonderful relationship. They work really hard, very professional. That's about all I can say.
Thank you, Cynthia. I have to say, it's very easy to enjoy our jobs when all the writers we work with are so talented. So thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff, anything you wanted to add about this?
Sure. Yeah, I'd say like the process was very well communicated in advance. There's like a kind of a formula and a process that's followed every step of the way. And I think everything was on time and as expected and things like that. So I think that's probably the most important thing for me, was the expectation setting and having everything follow through according to schedule.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you. And Eric, closing us out, any pleasant surprises you encountered in working with Atmosphere?
Well, the biggest surprise was to have a wonderful book. And I'm not blowing my own horn, but the book was beautiful and beautifully done. And it's true. I think that what Cynthia says is especially true. Very, very helpful to have post-publication support from the press. And it's been a delight, really. Uh, I I'm rooting for Atmosphere.
Thank you. We
I never
certainly can't take all the credit for this great book, but thank you so much. At this time, we are about at the hour mark, so we're about ready to close out. But if you do have more questions, definitely feel free to get in touch with us at publicity@atmospherepress.com, and we'll be happy to forward your questions to the authors in question. But I will say right now, I just want to thank our authors for sharing with us today. As always, it's just amazing to hear the work of writers in their own voices. So thank you so much to Eric, to Jeff, and to Cynthia for being generous with your time, your words, and of course, your thoughts in today's event. And thank you to everyone in the audience for celebrating these wonderful authors with us as well. Don't forget that you can order the Book of Reading, How Boys Learn, and Falling Through the New World from the links in the chat. And please also consider checking out atmospherepress.com to browse our new and forthcoming releases, to sign up for our email newsletter, or to submit a book manuscript of your own. You can submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com and let us know that you attended today's event. So we'll look forward to hearing from you, but until then, that's it. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.